So welcome to part 2 of our guide to the Silmarillion, and Jacob is still with me to talk about what exactly there is in the covers of this book, which you may have on your shelf but not yet have got all the way through. So the Second Age is now becoming much more familiar to all of us thanks to the Amazon Prime series. Do you want to tell us a little bit about what the Ancalabeth is about? Because we've moved completely away from the elves, don't we, in this? It's a real change of scene.
Exactly. Yeah, and this one really is different. And you mentioned this in the last episode, that it's a kind of a different, separate story. So the Quintus Silmarillion ends with the end of the First Age, really, right? So the Silmarils are gone, are no longer part of it, and it's not the children of Feanor kind of driving things. Now you have men, which aren't just exclusively male, right? So that's this catch-all term for humanity. And they become much larger players here. So this is section, this Ancalabeth, is literally, it means the downfalling. And it's the downfall. The subtitle that Julia shared earlier was it's the fall of Numenor, right? So it's a downfall and it's this world, this land, right? So at the end of the First Age, there were part of the factions of men were kind of helpers of the elves in their war against Melkor, renamed Morgoth, and they were, as kind of a reward, they were given a land of their own, this island called Numenor. Right. And it has ties, you see resonances with Atlantis myths. And actually, one of the words for Numenor is related to Atlantis in Elvish, but they get a different etymology that Tolkien kind of brings in there. So it's a gift. It's put kind of partway between the shores of Middle Earth and Valinor, the lands of the Valar, the gods. So it's kind of this halfway place. They can, just see how great it is, but they're still tied there. Because the part of this is something that you'll read with the Ainulindale, Valaquenta, and when the men are coming onto the scene, is that the fate of men are different from the fate of elves. So the elves can live in this state of like bliss in the presence of the gods until the end of the world, but humans have a different fate. They are not meant to live for ages and ages in happiness. They have a different fate, and they're kind of a people apart. They're referred to by the elves kind of as the strangers, that nobody, even the Valar, don't know exactly what happens to men after they die. They know what happens to elves. They're all tied up within the same world, but men are these kind of strangers on the scene that only the high god Iluvatar knows what they're all about and what will happen to them afterwards. But they have an enormous impact here on the world. And so the Ancalabeth is essentially this, following this land, this Numenor, this kind of Atlantis-like land, and this kind of rise and then fall of these people. And of course, and this is the period that the Amazon Rings of Power is really set in. And you see that's what we're going to be following here, is the kind of the grandeur of the kingdom of men here in Numenor, and then how that all goes wrong.
Yeah, so I mentioned in my podcast before the series came out that they're bringing two key events into parallel. So the making of the rings happens in around 1600, which is the equivalent of Tudor times in the Second Age, and the downfall of Numenor is in 3700 and something. So it's like Star Trek period, way into the future from us. But in order to make the sense of a story and have connecting characters, they're bringing them in parallel. So what they won't have time to do is show the succession of kings of Numenor and the occasional queen And in fact, it's told in quite a summary form in the Silmarillion as well. There's much more detail, I think, in particularly in the Unfinished Tales. There's much more about Numenor. But it does spend a fair bit of time at the last king, who's this person called Ar-Pharazôn, who is not good news. He's a bit like a sort of he reminds me a bit like the Pharaoh figure. I mean, his name suggests that to a certain extent. He's sort of got his pretensions, and he wishes to. He's the one who falls because Sauron is there as a sort of glamorous tempter and tells him, "Oh, you can go into the West. You know, why do you don't have to stay?" And so he's like biting the fruit of the tree of knowledge. He sets sail, and of course that means that there's a kind of slapback doesn't seem quite the right word. But there's a punishment that unleashes, and that is why Numenor sinks beneath the waves. You may remember, just to kind of be really geeky about this, that in the films, Eowyn talks about a dream of a tidal wave coming over the land. That is linking to Numenor, that image of the island that sinks. But out of the wreck comes the ones who remain true and are friends to the elves. And I'm sure this is going to feature largely in the Amazon series. This is Elendil and his sons, Isildur and what's the other one? Yuzivem. I'll come back to him. Anyway, Isildur and Elendil are the two key guys. And they set up kingdoms, the North and South kingdoms in Middle-earth, which leads us into the Third Age. So that, in brief, is what happens to Numenor. So the Ancalabeth tells that story. And then the final section of the Silmarillion is called Of the Rings of Power and the Third Age. So this actually involves quite a lot of Second Age material, the Rings of Power stuff, as well as how it connects to the Third Age. So if you're wanting just to understand the material behind Lord of the Rings and the Amazon series, then this is probably a primer for you. If you've read the appendices of Return of the King, this is the next place to go, because you've got the story, which they're not entirely sticking to, but of how the Rings of Power are forged. Do you want to say something about the Second Age and the Rings of Power and what happens there?
Yeah, I mean, it's again, like you said, it's in the appendices, Lord of the Rings, and they kind of the prologue to the Fellowship of the Ring film, where you get kind of again like that, showing what's happening there. But yeah, you see some of these, right? The rings, how they function, who gets them, what they do, and it's tied. And all of this chronologically, it's tied to the Akalabeth, where we really get him and his involvement. So you see how this actually, you might think, why would people willingly choose these rings to this clearly terrible 10-foot tall, spiky helmeted person. Yeah. But what you find out earlier is that's not how he looked at the time, right? During Numenor, Sauron actually was one of the most beautiful, he appeared as somebody who was really beautiful, was really charismatic, and ended up winning people over, sweet talking people, getting in with politicians, slowly actually kind of corrupting their kind of sense of worship, religious worship, from Iluvatar, who the humans were worshiping. And the only time you actually get mention of actual religion in Lord of the Rings explicitly is in the Akalabeth, where humans have kind of a holy place where they bring the first fruits of the harvest up to kind of offer to Iluvatar. So Sauron is kind of corrupting, changing that from worshiping Iluvatar to Morgoth, which was Sauron's commander. Essentially, he was Morgoth's lieutenant, depending on which side of the pond you're on. So he is really strategic, and so you show him kind of distributing these the rings around. So you get a better idea of how this would have happened. These weren't just, idiotic dwarfs or humans. It gives you, I think it helps to nuance it a bit, and you see exactly how it fits in. So that's something that, again, I think can enrich your reading of Lord of the Rings to understand what's at stake there.
The way it's arranged actually is a bit confusing for the timeline, because in the Rings of Power part, Sauron is doing his Tudor meddling, if I'm allowed to use a kind of easy to imagine timeline. And it's described how he is not trusted by Galadriel, Gil-galad, or Elrond, but Celebrimbor, who is the grandson of our favorite Fëanor, so he's got a troubled background. He respects this Sauron, who's under another name, for his craftsmanship, because he shows Celebrimbor how to create rings that capture a sort of essence or power. And it's described how, and again, this echoes what you get in the prologue to Lord of the Rings, the film, how that when he forges the one ring in Mount Doom, hoping to sort of do what his master was trying to do, that is enmesh everybody in his web. But when he puts on the ring, the elves who have their 3 rings, which they made, or Celebrimbor made, can understand his desires. And so they hide their rings, which leaves the dwarf rings and the rings for men out there sort of vulnerable. And the 7 dwarf rings are the foundation of the 7 dwarf hordes, like the riches, but they all end horribly, eaten by dragons or whatever. It's not good. And their fate is kind of slightly, they're not sure what happens to some of them. And then, of course, the rings for the men end up with the Black Riders. So really not a good trajectory there either. So that comes out of that period there, and he's working out that fate. And there's a battle that happens in the Rings of Power section where I'm afraid the odds aren't good for the outcome for Celebrimbor, but there is a sort of pushback of Sauron, and then he takes on the Númenóreans, and so that bit comes after. Then it weaves back into that section. So in fact, this is why it's not quite, it doesn't help you the way it's arranged, because you then get the end of the Second Age, which again takes us right back to the beginning of Peter Jackson's Lord of the Rings film. To tell us about that battle, who's there, who is the last alliance. So basically that's where all the story threads enmesh, is at that point. So Jacob, you can tell us in brief.
That's good. I think that's fantastic. And this is another one that I think a good entry point, if somebody's daunted by the Silmarillion as a whole, to take on it, because this is an essay, really summarizing it. So it's not really part of the Quenta Silmarillion proper. And so it's like the Akalabeth, which was kind of a separate story, and this one is essentially an essay that was kind of included at the end. So this one, it is, I think it's a fine place to start, because you'll be familiar with kind of what happens there, and it's done so in this kind of higher register of language. It's kind of more epic in tone. So if you finish Lord of the Rings, you could even, I think, easily pick up this essay. It's not terribly long. And just kind of read to get a sense for, you could still follow along with what's happening because you have some background information. It could be a way to kind of ease yourself into the way that Tolkien is telling these stories in the Silmarillion.
So the last battle of the last alliance, I should say, is where the elves led by Gil-galad team up with Elendil and Isildur and others. Elrond's there, and they take on Sauron and defeat him. This moment comes when Isildur cuts the ring. Everybody knows where I'm going now. Cuts the ring from the hand of Sauron, which enables he has foolishly invested so much power in this ring because he was using it as a way of controlling others, and it ends up being the thing that defeats him, and he is defeated for a time. And then the story continues in this essay, and you get really a summary of the events that run up in advance of the Lord of the Rings, and also a summary of Lord of the Rings, but seen not from the point of view of the hobbits, but as if a historian was telling it. So it's quite interesting to see it retold at that level. So, for example, you get the discussions of the council, like Gandalf and Saruman and Elrond. You get to see those discussions. And you get it's all very summary. It's like a page. So in fact, the end, Return of the King, the end is like this. Then Sauron failed, and he was utterly vanquished and passed away like a shadow of malice. And the towers of Barad-dûr crumbled in ruin. And at the rumour of their fall, many lands trembled. Thus peace came again, and a new spring opened on earth. So it's extremely summary.
Right. And even before that, it talks about, right, the mention, I don't know if you have it there right with you, where it talks about how it describes Frodo conquering. I think it's just a sentence or two just right before that.
Oh, yeah. And then it just goes, for Frodo the halfling, it is said, at the bidding of Mithrandir, took on himself the burden, and alone with his servant, he passed through peril and darkness, and came at last in Sauron's despite, even to Mount Doom. And there into the fire where it was wrought, he cast the great ring of power. And so at last it was unmade and its evil consumed. There you are. That's the plot of Lord of the Rings.
Lord of the Rings. You got it. Yeah.
I read it now.
why read however many hundreds of pages then when you can just have it in a couple sentences there, right? But it says, right, so you see, like, I think it's important you pointed out the perspective, right? So the Silmarillion, so this is framed as stories that from elves. So this is kind of the epic history of the elves from the elvish perspective, and it comes translated presumably by Bilbo, right, when he hands those volumes to Frodo that he's been working on in Rivendell, translating these from the tales of the elves. This is kind of presumably what Bilbo's been working on, translating, kind of compiling this as kind of the meta overarching kind of like narrative story here. And so this is, everything is from elvish point of view with their biases, with what they're paying attention to. And so, they don't mention Sam, right?
No. And Gandalf is not called Gandalf, he's called Mithrandir, which is their name for him.
Exactly.
So you look for the names, it will tell you whose point of view it is. Yeah.
Right. And I think that's helpful for understanding the Silmarillion as a whole, is that this is kind of, whereas Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit are kind of told from a hobbitish point of view, this one is, the Silmarillion is told from an elvish point of view. So it's in a different register with different scales of time, scopes of time. So that might be helpful for orienting first-time readers.
Yeah. So we've reached the end of the text now, except for a couple of family trees, but that's it really. So just to recap, you start with the creation story, which you've pronounced so beautifully. I'll get you to do that again. Music of the
Ainulindale.
Thank you. It was worth bringing you onto the podcast just for that. Then you've got the first stage material, which is the Quenta Silmarillion. And then you've got the second age material about the downfall of Númenor, the Ankh-Alabeth. And then you've got the second and third age essay, which is of the Rings of Power in the third age. You can read all of those separately. But we've been sort of signposting you to which ones you might want to start with. So question for you, Jacob, which is, why is it so difficult to read, do you think?
Yeah, I think it's the expectations that people have set by Lord of the Rings, right? And how it's, the language, the dialogue, right? So it's closer to kind of what you're used to in contemporary novels. Whereas, and I think it's a helpful parallel for those familiar with the Christian Bible, with the Old Testament and New Testament, right? So people, if you're used to the gospel specifically with the stories of Jesus, they're more fast paced. You have, extended episodes sometimes of like interactions, people talking to each other, It's focused on relationships, and sometimes there's casual references to stories of people from the past, or quotes, small quotes from stories from the past. That's what Lord of the Rings is. And so if all you have is those kind of fast moving stories of Jesus in the Gospels, and you start at the Old Testament with the creation of the world, and then a series of genealogies, and then this, histories of kings and judges, and then the stories that get repeated again, and then so like that's jarring. That's why a lot of Christians don't make it through reading the Old Testament. They just stick to the New Testament. But in reading through that background material, everything that's happening there in the Gospels is built upon the foundation, these stories, these threads, these themes that are happening to this people for the past, few thousand years before. So there's very similar parallels in how, the Old Testament and New Testament are functioning to, say, the Silmarillion, how that is framed, and then the Lord of the Rings. So I think that's for a lot of people that I've spoken with, they stop because I think they're expecting more of Lord of the Rings in tone and pacing, and they're not getting that. And so it can be frustrating, which is completely understandable.
So I'm now going to allow you one pick. So listeners are going to give us one chance to get us, into it. If you're coming to it from the Lord of the Rings, which is the bit that you think would be most interesting for a Lord of the Rings fan to actually have a go at?
Yeah, I think so. I think it depends.
No, you've got to have just one. I'm going to be cruel. It's got to be just one.
I know. Well, this is what I was going to say. So I think my answer is it would depend on what you like most about Lord of the Rings. So if you like romance and adventure, like the adventure part of Lord of the Rings, if that's what captured you most, then Beren and Luthien story, I think that one would probably most give you the same kind of feel of adventure, quest, unimaginable odds, failure, unexpected successes. I think Beren and Luthien, for people for whom the adventure pull from Lord of the Rings was there. But if you like what happens if you like elvish songs and elvish prayers, if like the elf culture is what really like fascinates you most, then then reading, say, the Ainulindale and the Valaquenta, those shorter sections at the beginning, that I think will feed you in the way that you need to be fed, that you liked from Lord of the Rings. If you wish that there was more elves in Lord of the Rings, and you just kind of want to sit there and listen to their songs and and culture, then I think the Ainulindale and Valaquenta would do that. But again, if you like the dynamics between men and elves, and their dynamic, and like the struggle between those people, then I think, the of men, figuring out where they came from, the section of men and the Akalabeth would be great to start.
No, you're breaking the rules because you basically have said.
So I gave everything. I would think, okay, if I had to boil it down, I think most people love like the rich world of Lord of the Rings, the adventure, as well as the sense of like mythology that like undergirds it. And so I would say Beren and Luthien would be my final answer. If I had to.
Yeah, you go for Beren and Luthien, because I'm going to go, as of today, having sat and reread it, is The Voyage of Eärendil, because I think that has some really brilliant.
Yeah.
I mean, you'll find out how awful Elrond's childhood was. He gets basically kidnapped. There's a whole kind of I'd forgotten about that. He and his brother. So for me, that was. And there's also a real sense of bravery and sacrifice, which foreshadows what Frodo does in what Eärendil does. So that's my recommendation. Okay, so the other sort of poser here, just as we draw things to a close, is if you want to understand the Amazon series, where would you go? The Rings of Power. I think that's fairly obvious, isn't it?
Yeah. And if you want, and then I would just, if you're ambitious, then the Akalabeth kind of gives you the immediate background there, because I think there's going to be significant overlap there, because there is with what's happening in the appendices in there. So so again, that essay of the Rings of Power in the Third Age, that's an easy place to go to. And if you if you're feeling ambitious and you want just like a little bit more, just go to the previous chapter, and that should give you more than enough information to fill in the gaps. And
So thank you. That's been hopefully helpful to the people who are picking up the Silmarillion and thinking, what on earth is going on, or what in Arda is going on.
Right.
I think it's something I definitely have learned to appreciate. The more you know about something, the more you appreciate the texture and the depth. And so it may take people a while, but you get there. And let us know what your favorite bits are.
Yeah, and I think if it's okay, I'd like to something that helped me in some of my rereads through and getting through it for the first time, because again, it is, in as much I haven't found it helpful people to say like, well, just be patient and read through it, or read through it 5 times and then you'll understand it. Like, that's not really hopeful. Like, if I'm not getting it the first time, I can see how that's really discouraging. So I mentioned last episode that like the biggest thing I think that was helpful for me is that I wasn't alone. There are other people who have read this material, who have talked about it. So the 2 resources that I've found, or a few resources, if you just want to go in on your own and read it, something that I think is helpful is to listen along as you're reading to the audiobook by Martin Shaw.
Oh, it's brilliant. Absolutely brilliant. Yeah.
So that, I think that's helpful, because like if you're just, because sometimes you're just sitting there and reading words, like there's some people that if they're reading a phone book and it's captivating, like Martin Shaw can do that, right? So his voice, and he's helping, and he's pronouncing, and his pronunciation sometimes doesn't align well with Tolkien's pronunciation, but you're hearing the words. So I think that can be helpful for people who feel that they're struggling. Just listening to that while you're reading it, I think, can be a way to like make it more engaged. That's one thing if you just want to do it solo. If you really do want to help somebody, kind of have somebody who can guide you through, there's 2, I think, for like very, very beginning. Dr. Corey Olson, who's nicknamed the Tolkien professor. He podcasted. He did a survey course at his university on Tolkien's writings, and has 9 different class periods that are under an hour each on the Silmarillion. And so this is for an undergraduate audience. So it's very, and he says like, here's what you're going to be reading, and so you can read those sections and then listen to the class discussion to get some of the high level talking about some of those topics through that. So 9 episodes. So that's less than 9 hours that you can stop. And that was helpful for me, was stopping after I'd read a section and then reading something about it, kind of refamiliarizing myself, recontextualizing myself with somebody else to kind of help refresh it and make sure that I understood what was happening, because it's a lot of information, and it can be overwhelming for first time readers. For those first time readers who are more ambitious, or you're going through for a second time, for some of the audience who will be rereading the Silmarillion, I highly recommend the Prancing Ponies podcast. And they have almost 50 episodes where they're looking, chapter by chapter, having hour and a half kind of conversations where they're bringing in, they're not only kind of situating it in context of Lord of the Rings, but also they're bringing in some additional material from Unfinished Tales and from the history of Middle Earth. So they're really doing some really, really important, I think, and thorough discussions. So first time readers, I think wetting your feet, I think going along with this undergraduate class over 9 periods, that's manageable and would be helpful to just kind of give you encouragement and help you understand, keep you on track to finish. But then for those people either who want more, and for people who are rereading the Silmarillion, then the Prancing Pony podcast, going along through, stopping after you read those sections, listen to those. I did that for my second to last read through and found it really, really, really helpful and entertaining as well.
And of course, what we're doing here in our readathon is just doing the encouragement of reading with others. Because I think you don't obviously have to listen to any of these extra materials to give your first thoughts on the Silmarillion. We're not about we're about creativity and what it inspires you to imagine and think. So don't feel that you have to have a PhD in the Silmarillion before you volunteer to read a chapter. We just wanted to give you access to these resources which have helped us. Right. So before we finish, Jacob, we always have where in all the fantasy worlds is the best place for something. And I was humming and hawing about themes in the Silmarillion, and I decided one which I hadn't touched on before is exile, because in fact the elves are in exile, the ones that we meet in Middle-earth, the Galadriel type elves. And I was thinking, where in all the fantasy worlds is the best place to be in exile? Because you get that hankering from the country you came from, but that may not be quite what you want, because you're also in love with the place you have arrived at. So have you got any fantasy worlds where you've thought about the theme of exile?
Yeah, looking, and it was a difficult question, trying to think of good. I mean, I don't know if the world of, pre-Renaissance Italy is considered a fantasy location, but right, Dante was famously in exile when he had the space to write and create the Divine Comedy, essentially. So barring an actual real world location and exile like that, I recognize how this might sound, but I think Earth, I think the Marvel Cinematic Universe Earth is the best place to go into exile, like Thor, right? Thinking of Thor,
what a good
gets
pick.
exiled, right, from Asgard, and then he, like you said, he's longing for home, but then learns more about himself as he comes to love the world of humans, and ultimately makes him better, and has all sorts of rollicking adventures with other heroes at the time. So, and it doesn't seem like you have whole scale. It seems like there'd be a lot more people dying there, but I think because it's owned by Disney, you don't have the wholesale carnage and slaughter that would probably actually happen in our world if you had these powers. So because of that, because it's a little bit safer for pedestrians in the world of the Marvel Cinematic Universe, and I think that's where I would choose to go into exile, especially if I was a son of Odin.
Yeah, good pick. That's a good pick. I hadn't thought of that one. It's actually the whole theme of exile, if you're a creative and thinking about fantasy, is a really fascinating one. It's a bit different from a theme we tend to associate with fantasy. And I was thinking it's very common in fairy tales. And actually, particularly the heroine's journey is very often an exile from a home. So picking on a fairy tale character, when I've said that, you can now think, oh yeah, the Little Mermaid and Beauty and the Beast and Cinderella, and you see all these people who are being sort of made homeless or not welcome in their own home. That form of exile. So of all of those fairy tale versions, I think probably the best place to go into exile is to join the dwarves in their house. That looks quite jolly, and lots of company. So she has one of the better exiles. Does Snow White. So that's my going into exile. Anyway, thank you so much for talking and spending so much time talking about this. And I hope that those who are listening will find this helpful. We will put the link to the resources that Jacob mentioned in our show notes. And do join in our readathon. Thank you very much for listening. Goodbye.
Thanks for listening to Mythmakers Podcast, brought to you by the Oxford Centre for Fantasy. Visit oxfordcenterforfantasy.org to join in the fun. Find out about our online courses, in-person stays in Oxford, plus visit our shop for great gifts. Tell a friend and subscribe wherever you find your favourite podcasts worldwide.